You're live.
The job market is not as strong as headlines are suggesting. It seems like the Fed is waiting to make a big decision on these job numbers, so it's extremely important that they're accurate.
Well, Trump just made a big statement this week. He fired the gal who's in charge of the labor stats, and he was pissed because they adjusted them by 250,000, which is a lot, by the way.
Yeah, it's only 0.16%, but it is a lot of jobs.
Look at you with the low percentage.
Statistics.
Oh, no, let me give you another one. Okay, so if you go year over year over year from like the 70s, the average is like 50,000 jobs.
Yep,
So okay, so this is a big deal.
it
Like
is.
when you're well over 100,000 a month, 250,000 in 2 months, that's a big deal, right? So if I'm the president, I'm like, what's happening? Because as we all know, what we were all questioning already was how accurate are these numbers? Because they come out and they're like, oh yeah, and then they adjust, and then nobody really pays attention to the adjustment.
Well, we always talk about what, even when Biden was president, we were talking about what a bad spot that it felt like the economy was in, but these job numbers kept coming in strong. And now this is really a hit to the jobs numbers because it's down a lot from even what they thought their projections were going to be. But I thought it was interesting because now, before high job numbers are good for the president, so nobody complains about that. But now that Trump wants the Fed to cut rates and they're basing them off these job numbers, now he wants to question the job numbers.
Well, right, because as we all know, he's banging on Powell, right? He's like, well, you need to lower rates, lower rates, lower rates, even set up to 3 percentage points, right?
Yeah.
And Powell's like, F you, basically. But Trump's like, well, you guys know the drama. If you don't know the
Well,
drama, you should look. But by the way, the reason I bring that up first is because he wants rates down. That's going to create another bubble. But the other thing the Fed, to your point, doesn't really talk about a lot are the job numbers because they've been flat, right? They haven't really been
well,
that.
problem. So the Fed has to look at two things. They have to look at inflation and job numbers, right? And they've been able to keeping these rates high and hiring the rates because of inflation, because inflation was a problem. But now with the job numbers, being a problem, the Fed may have to pivot in September and, look at
Right.
starting to cut rates. Unfortunately, this didn't happen, before this meeting, so now we do have to wait.
Right. So, but let's talk about the history because we dug into this. Like,
Yeah.
why do they give us one number and then adjust? Like they've been doing this for years, by the way, under all the different presidents. So this
Mhm.
isn't a Trump thing, but this 250,000 jobs in 2 months, that is a big difference from what has happened over the prior presidencies.
Yeah, you have to look. So before 2010, which I thought was interesting because I feel like 2010, we never really fully recovered from the Great Recession in a lot of people's minds, right? With wage growth and everything didn't really keep up to pre-2008. So in 2010, they changed how they were calculating unemployment. So before they were doing household surveys, basically. So they would just interview households who's involved in your household that's working in the workforce. And then they also would then randomly survey businesses, right? Like how many jobs have you added? How many hours? What are the wages, etc. So that was what they did before 2010.
And I think it's important to know that they've changed the rules of how they report right
Mhm.
now, but these are 15 years old, so it's not something that just happened. But things did get kind of squirrely in 2020. We'll get there.
Yeah, so basically
Yes,
they were
we'll get there.
focusing on they were focusing on like the unemployment rate, the job creation, and labor force participation. But then if you look in 2020, they changed it even more. So 2010 and 2020, they were changing it a little bit, but starting in 2020, they really started to change it. And that is interesting because that's when Biden was president, that's when COVID happened, everything else. So now they're relying on model-based estimates, right? So
And seasonal
and
adjustments.
seasonal
Yeah.
adjustments. Okay.
Big difference, by the
Yep.
way.
Yep. So that's what's creating these massive revisions that are super common. And they're using a lot of AI and data modeling. So I don't like when the government says they're using forecast and modeling and all these things that are too hard to understand. It's kind of what they did with the inflation data, right?
But
They
let's
made
get
it all complicated and now they're making the job numbers all
But
complicated.
let's give them a clear example of what this means. Essentially, they're taking they're in the inclusion of part-time and multiple job holders. So if you guys have like one, two, three jobs. Let's say you have a job and you drive Uber, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, they count that as two jobs, right? Before it was a little different before. Now maybe that's right, maybe that's not right, but that's how much it's different. And so it's inflating the job number. So as people are getting squeezed more with inflation and they hold multiple jobs just to try to make ends meet, so you, the viewer, have multiple jobs in this jobs report. So one person, one person, two part-time jobs, or two full-time jobs even is two jobs added. And that's a big, big difference.
Yeah, and I think too the gig economy is really interesting as well because driving for Uber 10 hours a week is really not a job. So say you lose your job and you're unemployed, if you start driving for Uber just to barely pay your bills, and mind you, when you drive for a gig job, you're not really making that much money because you have a lot of expense on the back end with your car and gas and everything else, but that's counted as a job, right? So you're not unemployed per the government, even though it's like this gig work, which is not really
Right.
work.
So we were calling this job inflation. Like
Yeah.
it's really job inflation, right? If
Yep.
you think about it. Like, so the other thing that it does is it assumes, this is a really interesting, it assumes that a new businesses are creating jobs even if there's no hard data.
Yeah, they just assume. So if
Like,
you start
so
a
imagine
business,
that. Let,
if you start a business, they just assume that
yeah.
this business is hiring X amount of jobs
Yeah.
depending on how big it is.
Right, right. So they were relying before on the birth death model. So this is very, very different. And I think that so obviously you guys know who's in business. When you start a business, I don't know about you, one thing that kills a business are jobs, like
Right.
overhead, right? Now, when you have the income, makes complete sense, right? You need to leverage it and grow it and all that kind of stuff. But when you start a job, and when you start a business, sorry, very often the last time you work your butt off for a long period of time, typically before you bring that next person on. There's a lot of businesses that are one person jobs, right?
Hmm.
A lot. So there's a huge category for that. And your run of the mill stuff that you guys probably use each and every day. Um, but so that's the other way. And then the job quality is another one, right?
Yeah, they like we were saying, they count the gigs the same as a full-time job. So basically, whether you get a full-time job with Apple or you're driving for Uber 10 hours a week, it's a job and they
Yeah.
count it the same. And it's really not the same because before, when they were doing the household surveys, it was calculating in wages, part-time, full-time. If they still did the household surveys, it would count gig work separately, most likely. So they're not right now. So now they're forecasting and they're, just counting job for job. And realistically, if people are losing their full-time job and having to get two part-time jobs in order to just make ends meet, and you would imagine that they're probably making less money on those two part-time jobs than their full-time job, that actually is good for the jobs report. That actually shows as a net positive the way things are calculated right now because you took away one job from the economy and you added two. So it's really inaccurate data that they're relying on, which I think Biden really liked because it pumped up his economy numbers. And I think Trump wouldn't mind it either, except for now it's affecting the Fed rate cuts, which is, Trump's really all about that. So that's why he's now wanting to dissect this and possibly start going back to the old school way of doing the numbers.
So yeah, so I don't know if firing the BLS is. I went through this data. Like she was the commissioner. Apparently, she in her defense, all she does is read the data. But I guess you got to cut the head off the snake at some point, and then just tear the whole thing down and start to take a look at what's meaningful. What would be meaningful for us, to be able to make accurate, decisions upon the media, be reported. Like, what would that be? And it just seems like it's a complete cluster at the
Yeah.
moment, because right now the weaker job growth oftentimes is even just getting ignored by the media and and policy at this point. And I think this job inflation is a real thing.
Yeah, and Josh on YouTube said they should just count full-time and part-time jobs. The hard part about that is how, right? Because you can't just poll every single business and person in the country because that would just be too difficult. So that's why these household surveys, however they distributed them, were as accurate as you really could be. It would be hard to do that all, based on every single person in business in the whole country. So, but it's not a bad idea. And I think these household surveys kind of did that to the best of their ability. Maybe with AI, there's better ways, but these forecasting models, when you start saying stuff like that, there's a lot of room for, shadow that no if they make it so complicated that you can't understand it, then it's really not helpful. Tucker Carlson, we talked about the other week, said that with the GDP. Like the GDP can be great, but if my kid can't afford a house on a full-time job, there's a problem,
Right,
right?
right.
But it's same thing with the jobs numbers, right? It's like, okay, you guys can do all these forecasts and AI models, but if I can't find a job or I can't find a good enough job to survive, then it's not accurate.
And so let's just get real crystal clear on exactly what happened this week, right before he fired her. So there's three things that happen each time for the jobs. The first one is the preliminary job report. That's the first Friday of the month. That comes out, okay? Then the second one is revised 1 month later, and then the third one is revised 2 months later. So what happened was May and June were revised by 258,000 jobs. Now think about that number. Like that is in my opinion, you might call it, I don't know, 1 or 2%. I don't know. That's a lot.
0.16.
Yeah, that's a lot of people. 258 grand. Like, so, okay.
258,000.
Oh, 258,000. Sorry. But that's a big number,
Yeah, it
right?
is.
And I don't know, like one of the things that we haven't really chatted about is AI, right? So this, I'm sure, is keeping Trump up at night.
Yeah,
Right? It has to,
absolutely.
right?
Yep.
Like the numbers are, all over the place. That where people, what I'm seeing now, especially in marketing companies, we were talking about this last night. You know, uh, like, do you really need a graphic artist? Do you really need a content writer? Do you really need somebody who does all the social media and, newsletters and stuff like that anymore? Like
Because
those,
of AI.
correct, because of AI, right? So think of all that work. Or how about customer service, right? These are things that are being replaced by AI as businesses get squeezed from inflation as well. They're starting to look at, so if somebody leaves the company for some reason, the question should always be, can I use AI or do I need to replace them? Right. So that should be the question. And, it just completely depends on the business. But it's a very interesting thing. And so I think that this is a headwind that this administration is just going to be fighting the whole time.
Well, and it's more about data credibility than anything. And I think that's really coming to the forefront right now between whether it's credibility in your news sources. Tucker Carlson mentioned the GDP. Now, everyone knows the inflation data is incorrect. You can go to shadowstats.com and see the real inflation. Now you're looking at job numbers with the same issue. So it's really more of a data accuracy issue than it is anything else. And trying to get that cleared up is going to make people have faith in the numbers because it's not just about the numbers, it's about believing in the numbers.
Well, yeah, the initial reports, as we all would, they create this false market optimism, right? And then what happens is the revisions, they get buried in the news cycle. When is the last time you guys remember a revised job report? Like, you know what I mean? Like, I remember job reports. We all look at those. Okay, looks good. But to go 258,000 jobs, an adjustment in 2 months, that's a massive mistake, in my opinion. Especially if you look at history, there's always a little bit of revisions. I don't know if that's right or wrong, the way that they've been doing that, but this is so far above what it's been. So, and I think, it certainly brought a lot of attention. And so some people are like, oh no, Trump's in charge of reporting jobs. you know, uh, I agree, right? Is
Yeah.
that a good thing? Is that not a good thing? We will see. But what's been done has not been good, in my opinion. Like you
No.
can't rely on that jobs report ever in the beginning. You basically have to wait for the revisions.
You don't even know how accurate their revisions even really
But,
are.
but think of all the decisions that are made around that, right? A lot, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So the question is why? So why is Trump targeting this in 2025? And I think that's, first of all, anytime you can go through and scrub down an agency and look at it from top to bottom and try to figure out how to get better data, I think that's good. The
Hmm.
question is I think there's a trust issue with the public on
Yeah.
the way it's been done and potentially on the way it could be done,
Yeah,
right?
there definitely is. But I definitely think it's important to note that the reason Trump cares so much is because of his battleground with the Fed right now.
Yes.
And we're going to get into should the Fed cut rates now, or what do we think that the Fed is going to do based on this new data. But first, we have our sponsor, Monetary
Yeah,
Metals.
let's go see that.
Their all-time highs. But appreciation isn't the only way to benefit. Monetary metals, you could potentially earn a yield on your gold, paid in physical gold, without selling it. Here's how it works. When you lease your gold through their platform, pre-qualified companies pay to use it under strict guidelines, like renting out real estate, but with gold. Instead of paying to store your metal, you may earn up to 4% annually in gold. You stay in control and you can choose which leases to participate in. Monetary Metals handles the due diligence, lease terms, and all the administration. Thousands of investors use this approach to grow their gold, not just sit on it. Visit monetary-metals.com/Ken to learn more. Leasing gold involves risk and returns are not guaranteed. This is not an offer to buy or sell securities. Please review all risk disclosures at monetary-metals.com. Visit monetary-metals.com/Ken to learn more.
Okay, so let's talk about why Trump's focused on this. So he has two reasons. First of all, he said people are not working more; they're just working more jobs to survive. I believe that's a true statement, right?
Hmm.
Right. But he believes that this is making a weaker economy. I'm sorry, it's masking a weaker economy, and it's used to justify delaying the Fed rate cuts, and I think that's really his big issue,
It
right?
is his big issue, and it's something that Powell has to look at too, because the Fed is also trusting the job numbers. So they made their decisions over the past few months, including the one they made the other day, based on the job numbers they were receiving.
Right. So he's considering going back to that pre-2000s methodology, but we will see. Obviously, he doesn't even have a replacement.
Yeah,
Right? This
absolutely.
just happened, right? So the labor force participation rate, we're trying to take a look now at is there really job inflation or signs of trouble? So the labor force participation rate is still lower than pre-COVID, and what that means is that's literally what it means. It means people that can work are participating. That's what that means. But part-time and gig jobs, they're up actually. While I would say the full-time jobs, they're a little more stagnant right now.
Yep, absolutely. And I think that the Fed is going to start to cut rates probably when they meet in September. Depending on how urgent it is by that point will determine whether it's a quarter point or a half a point. We were watching the what program we were watching this
Yeah,
morning?
money matters.
Money Matters, and they were expecting three rate cuts by the end of the year, probably
We'll
quarter
see.
point each.
I think that's probably not too far off. Like
Mhm.
they're saying a quarter point each. Who knows, right? It's a complete guess at this point. A lot of it's going to depend on when the tariff, because also in there, Tim Cook is at the White House today, by the way, the CEO of Apple, to talk about how he's going to invest in this big campus outside of Houston. Trump's super happy, obviously, about this because he wants to bring jobs back into the U.S. People are like, oh my God, is my iPhone going to be $3,000 now? You know what I mean? And they're all freaking out. So anyway, it's an interesting debate. But the point is that Apple came out and calculated what they thought tariffs were going to be next year. And this is very interesting because that what they're saying that they can't necessarily, this is interesting because this is what Trump was saying all along. They're saying they can't really jack the prices to the consumer because the consumer will just stop. There's a point, right? So what it's really doing is it's eroding the corporate margins, the corporate profits. And so that's what I think, so Apple's being proactive and saying, okay, Mr. Trump, like, maybe we can do some negotiation or we'll do this and build this big AI plant outside of Houston. And, if you help us here. So this is going to be really interesting. So using tariffs to try to get some of the U.S. companies back into the U.S. Is at least bringing them to the bargaining table, including today, right?
Yeah. So what I think would be interesting about this is now that, and if Jerry, if you could put our podcast, that we do once a week up on the lower third, we're going to be talking about that this week on our podcast. Is the Fed now is going to be probably focused on the employment rate, which is going to make them have to perhaps up the inflation rate, right? So they had this 2% target on inflation. Now they're going to have a 3% target on inflation, most likely, if they're going to be lowering the rates to order to accommodate the jobs. So that will be interesting. And maybe the next thing that we're looking at is, does that target rate of inflation move? And if it does, then what does it mean for hard assets, gold, crypto, all of those things?
Right. And then the other side of that from a Fed level is, how should we measure employment? That's a big old question, right? Because there's a lot of really smart people taking a look at this over the years, right? It was one way up until the 2000s, then it changed, as we've already talked about in the last 15 years. Trump's trying to bring it back. I actually do agree with that.
Yeah.
And we dug into this years ago. There's like 6 different levels. There's if you just lost your job and you're still looking, if you just lost your job and you're not looking. There's all these categories actually below. Is it got the U1 through U6, I think is what it is. Just go take a look. It's really, really complicated. And what they do is they manipulate the data very similar to what they were doing with inflation. They kind of replaced out the goods. For example, I think gasoline and housing is not in the inflation number, as an example. And then they just, the owner's equivalent of rent, which is another one, which is one that I follow, is a flippin' joke. You guys should dig into that. Like, it's the most incredible statistics. It's like, okay, let's say you own a home, and you're like, okay, they come to you and say, what would you rent it for? The owner's equivalent of rent. Like, that's how complicated this is, or uncomplicated. So I like the fact that they're getting into this data, because I think the data credibility is needed. It's one more issue that not a lot of people talk about, and it's we all make decisions around it, right? So data credibility is a huge issue. I think it's going to be something that this administration really digs into. It's going to be a battleground.
Yeah, and if the rates start to drop, do you see asset prices like real estate going back up, or do you think a quarter point correction is not going to really do much?
Well, I don't want to say a quarter won't do something, because it'll do something for sure. But how much, if you take a look at how many people own their homes outright, that's a huge number. If you look at how many people had mortgages under 4%, that's a huge number. So we're really talking about, as we know, it's a bit of a frozen market right now, with listings growing. The average listing is 53 days on the market, or at least it was a week ago. I don't know.
I think it's higher now.
It might be a little higher now, but it was 53 days. And so that's growing. Still not a bad number, however.
No.
But if you just come out of this market where you would put something on the market and there'd be people pulling up to your house in the morning and giving multiple offers, that's not healthy. Even though if you're the seller, you think it is, but it's not. So so I think we've got a little bit of room there. And so if rates go down, the 10-year Treasury was up at 422, I think, this morning, and that's about where it's been. So we're not seeing much relief there. But if rates go down significantly, maybe you'll start to see some movement here and there. But I don't think a 3/4 of a point is going to do much this year at all, personally. I mean, maybe a little bit.
What'll be interesting is if the Fed does drop their rates, if the rates actually drop, because it does depend also on the bond market. And the bond market was actually up this morning.
Look at her talking about the bond market. 2 years ago, she's like, what's a bond?
Not funny.
I thought it was really funny. That's pretty good.
Yeah.
Look at you. I mean, the bond market is wildly important, guys. So it is true.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's kind of what we'll be looking for. And we'll see you guys next week.
Okay, guys. Cheers.